Matthias Crane emerged from an earth mound barely 4 feet tall while his neighbors watched from 50 yards away, shivering despite fires that consumed the last of their firewood. Inside that moss-covered shelter they had mocked as a badger hole, the temperature held steady at 53 degrees with nothing but a cooking flame, and it was about to become the only reason some of them would survive the night. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier survival and forgotten innovation move you. Hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable than this one. Matthias Crane found his partner on the morning of December 18, 1851, frozen solid in the bunk they had built along the south wall of their cabin. Owen Hartwell had gone to sleep the night before, complaining of the cold but otherwise healthy, wrapped in 2 wool blankets and a bearskin that had cost them half a season's worth of beaver pelts. The fire in their stone hearth had burned down to coals sometime after midnight. By dawn, Owen was dead. The cabin was well built by frontier standards. Matthias and Owen had spent 5 days the previous autumn selecting and notching logs, chinning the gaps with moss and clay, and constructing a door thick enough to stop wind. They had even installed a proper chimney using river stones and mud mortar, something many trappers considered an unnecessary luxury. The structure measured 16 feet by 14 feet with a peaked roof covered in overlapping bark. It should have been adequate, but adequate was not enough when the temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Matthias had woken before dawn, as he always did, and immediately noticed the cold. His breath came out in thick clouds. The water bucket near the door had frozen solid. He called Owen's name twice before climbing down from his own bunk to check on his partner. Owen's face was gray. His eyes were half open, ice crystals visible on his eyelashes. The bearskin covering him was stiff with frost. Matthias stood there for a long time, looking at the body of the man he had trapped with for 3 seasons. Owen was 32 years old. He had come west from Pennsylvania in 1848, worked his way up the Missouri River, and learned the trapping trade through trial and considerable error. He was competent with rifles, patient with trap lines, and reliable in the ways that mattered in the wilderness. He should not have died in his sleep inside a cabin with a full woodpile stacked against the exterior wall, but he had. Matthias restarted the fire, feeding it until flames roared and heat filled the small space. It took 2 hours for Owen's body to thaw enough to move. Matthias wrapped him in canvas and buried him on a hillside overlooking the creek where they had set their best trap line. The ground was frozen 18 inches down. Digging the grave took most of the day. That night, alone in the cabin with a fire burning hot enough to make the stones glow, Matthias lay in his bunk and realized something that would consume him for the next 8 months. The cabin was a thermal sieve. Heat escaped through every gap in the chinking, through the spaces around the door, through the roof where warm air rose and leaked into the winter sky. No matter how much wood he burned, the fire could not overcome the fundamental problem of the structure itself. Log cabins were not built to hold heat. They were built to keep out rain and wind and provide a place to sleep that was better than open ground. In moderate cold, that was sufficient. But in extreme cold, the kind that came every few winters and killed men and animals with brutal efficiency, a log cabin was just a wooden box that delayed freezing. It did not prevent it. Matthias fed the fire throughout the night, burning wood at a rate that would exhaust his supply in less than a week if he maintained it. And, even with the massive fire, the temperature 10 feet from the hearth stayed cold enough to freeze water. Something had to change. Matthias spent the winter of 1851 observing how different structures handled cold. He continued running his trap lines, processing pelts, doing the work that kept him alive. But his mind was elsewhere. Every structure he encountered became a lesson in thermal dynamics he did not yet have words to explain. The first thing he noticed was root cellars. Most homesteaders in the Montana Territory had dug crude storage pits for vegetables and preserved foods. These holes in the ground, covered with logs and earth, stayed remarkably stable in temperature. Matthias began asking questions. How deep were they dug? What happened to food stored there during the coldest nights? Did the temperature inside change when surface conditions dropped to lethal levels? The answers were consistent. Root cellars 6 feet deep or more maintained temperatures well above freezing, even when the air outside could kill a man in minutes. Potatoes stored in September were still firm in February. The earth itself seemed to hold warmth that the air could not. In late January, Matthias traveled 3 days south to a settlement where a man named Isaac Brennan lived. Brennan was nearly 70 years old, a former miner who had worked silver claims in Colorado before retiring to trap. Matthias had met him once 2 years earlier and remembered Brennan mentioning the warmth of deep mines. He found Brennan in a cabin much like his own, burning wood constantly to stay alive. They talked through an afternoon and evening, and Brennan confirmed what Matthias suspected. Mines that went deep enough were warm, not hot, but stable. 50 degrees year-round, regardless of surface temperature. The deeper you went, the more the temperature stabilized. Brennan had worked in mines where men stripped to shirt sleeves despite winter raging above ground. The earth held heat, or perhaps more accurately, the earth resisted cold. 6 feet down, 8 feet down, 10 feet down, the temperature barely changed. It was a natural insulation that no amount of logs and chinking could replicate. Matthias returned to his trap lines with a new obsession. He began studying animal dens. Badgers dug complex burrows that descended at angles before opening into chambers. Bears hibernated in dens that were partially underground, often dug into hillsides where earth covered them on 3 sides. These animals survived months of winter in spaces that required no fire at all. Their body heat alone was sufficient because the earth held that heat instead of letting it escape. By March, when the worst of the cold finally broke, Matthias had filled a small notebook with observations and rough sketches. He drew cross-sections of root cellars. He estimated depths and angles. He sketched dome shapes and tunnel entrances. He calculated how much earth would be needed to cover a space, large enough for a man to live in. His neighbors thought he had gone strange with grief. Silas Drummond, who had a claim 4 miles west, told others that Crane had lost his mind along with his partner. Men did not live underground. They built cabins. That was how things were done. But Matthias was not interested in how things were done. He was interested in not freezing to death. April brought thaw and the beginning of Matthias's transformation from trapper to builder. He selected his location carefully, a south-facing hillside 200 yards from the creek where he and Owen had worked their trap lines. The slope was gentle enough to dig into, but steep enough to provide natural drainage. The soil was a mixture of clay and loam, stable enough to hold shape, but workable with basic tools. He began digging on April 23, 1852. The first day, 3 neighbors rode past and stopped to watch. Matthias was excavating a circular area approximately 12 feet in diameter, cutting horizontally into the hillside. He removed earth with a shovel, loaded it into a wooden sled, and dragged it downslope to create a level area in front of what would become his entrance. Silas Drummond was among the visitors. He sat on his horse and called down questions. What was Matthias building? A root cellar? No, a dwelling. A dwelling? Underground? Yes. Silas laughed. He told Matthias he was digging his own grave. The others laughed with him. They rode away, convinced Crane had indeed lost his mind to grief. Matthias kept digging. The excavation took 3 weeks. He worked methodically, cutting into the hillside and creating a dome-shaped cavity. The floor was roughly circular, 12 feet across. The walls curved upward and inward, meeting at a point approximately 8 feet above the floor at the center. The shape was deliberate. A dome distributed weight evenly across its entire surface. There were no corners to concentrate stress, no flat ceiling to support against collapse. He dug the entrance as a tunnel, 4 feet tall and 5 feet long, angling slightly upward from the main chamber. This created a cold sink. Heavy cold air would settle in the tunnel rather than the living space. It also meant the entrance could be small, minimizing heat loss. Other trappers stopped by regularly during construction. Some were genuinely curious. Most were skeptical. Thomas Whitmore, who had a cabin 6 miles north, asked detailed questions about structural integrity. Would the earth not collapse? What prevented cave-ins? How would Matthias waterproof the ceiling? Matthias explained his plan. He would build a framework of wooden ribs to support the earth above. He would layer the ceiling with bark, clay, and sod. He would create drainage channels to direct water away from the structure. The earth itself would be the insulation. Whitmore seemed interested but unconvinced. He wished Matthias well and rode away. Silas Drummond returned twice more during excavation. Each time he had new criticisms. The shelter would flood with the first rain, it would collapse under snow weight, it would fill with smoke and suffocate Matthias in his sleep. Living underground was what animals did, not men. A proper man built upward, constructed walls of timber, created something that showed his mastery over the wilderness. Matthias listened and said nothing. He simply continued digging. By mid-May, the excavation was complete. The chamber waited, a perfect dome carved into the Montana hillside, ready for the next phase of construction that would prove whether earth could protect better than timber. The structural framework began with wood selection. Matthias spent 4 days walking the surrounding forest, identifying young aspens and willows with the right combination of flexibility and strength. He needed branches that could bend into curves without snapping, thick enough to bear weight, but pliable enough to shape into the dome ribs he had designed. He cut 32 poles, each approximately 10 feet long and 3 inches in diameter at the base. Back at his excavation, he stripped the bark and shaped the ends into points. Then he began the delicate work of installing them. The poles formed a skeletal dome. He planted the base of each pole into the earthen floor, spacing them evenly around the chamber's perimeter. Then he bent them inward and upward, lashing the tops together at the center point with rawhide strips he had prepared from deer hides. The result looked like the frame of an enormous basket turned upside down. Between the main ribs, Matthias wove smaller branches horizontally, creating a lattice that would support the layers above. This took another week. The weaving had to be tight enough to hold clay but open enough to allow some flexibility. He worked from inside the chamber, his hands raw from manipulating the rough wood. Silas Drummond arrived with 2 other settlers on the afternoon of May 24th. They stood at the entrance tunnel and called inside. When Matthias emerged, dirt-covered and exhausted, Silas gestured at the framework. "It looked like a beaver lodge," Silas said, "or perhaps a giant bird nest." Was Matthias planning to line it with feathers? The others laughed. One of them, a man named Porter, asked serious questions beneath the mockery. What about water? The first heavy rain would turn the chamber into a mud pit. What about structural collapse? The framework looked fragile. What about air? How would Matthias breathe without windows? Matthias explained each concern methodically. He would create a drainage system, channeling water away from the structure. He would reinforce the framework with clay layers that would harden like pottery. He would install a ventilation shaft at the dome's peak, too small for weather to enter but adequate for air circulation. Porter listened but remained skeptical. He told Matthias that root cellars were one thing, living underground, full-time, was another. The darkness alone would drive a man mad. The dampness would rot his lungs. The isolation would destroy his spirit. Silas was less philosophical. He called it Crane's Badger Hole, and the name spread. Within 2 weeks, every trapper within 20 miles knew about the fool digging into a hillside to escape grief. Some pitied Matthias. Others mocked him openly. A few worried he was descending into genuine madness. Thomas Whitmore visited again in early June. He examined the framework carefully, testing the ribs, studying the weaving. He asked about the next steps. Matthias described his waterproofing plan, the layers he would build, the living roof he envisioned. Whitmore nodded slowly. He said nothing about madness or foolishness. He simply asked Matthias to send word when the construction was complete. He wanted to see the finished structure before judging whether it was genius or grave. The waterproofing began with birch bark. Matthias had collected sheets of it throughout May, carefully peeling bark from dead trees in sections as large as he could manage. Birch bark was naturally waterproof, flexible, and durable. Indigenous peoples had used it for canoes and shelters for generations. Matthias would use it as his first barrier against rain. He laid the bark sheets over his wooden framework in overlapping layers, starting from the bottom and working upward like shingling a conventional roof. Each sheet overlapped the one below by at least 6 inches. He secured them to the framework using thin strips of rawhide threaded through small holes. The work was tedious. Each sheet had to be positioned carefully to ensure water would flow downward and outward rather than finding gaps to penetrate. The bark layer took 9 days to complete. When finished, it formed a continuous shell over the entire dome. Matthias tested it by pouring water from buckets at various points. The water ran down the curved surface and dripped away from the structure. No leaks appeared inside the chamber. Next came the clay mixture. Matthias had spent weeks preparing this, digging clay from a deposit near the creek and mixing it with water, dried moss, and pine needles. The moss acted as reinforcement, like horsehair in plaster. The pine needles added structure and helped the mixture bind together. He stirred the combination in a wooden trough until it reached the consistency of thick mud. He applied the clay mixture directly over the birch bark, working from inside the chamber. He pressed it into the lattice framework, filling every gap, building up a layer approximately 3 inches thick. His hands were raw within hours. The clay was heavy and cold. It caked under his fingernails and cracked the skin on his knuckles. The application took 3 weeks. He could only work for a few hours each day before his hands became too damaged to continue. Each section had to be applied and allowed to partially dry before moving to the next area. Too wet and it would slump downward. Too dry and new clay would not bond to old. By late June, the entire dome was covered in a smooth clay shell. Matthias built small fires inside the chamber to help the clay cure. The smoke escaped through the ventilation shaft he had constructed at the peak, a hollow log extending 2 feet above the eventual roof surface. Over the hardened clay, Matthias added earth. He hauled dirt from his excavation pile and spread it across the dome surface, building up a layer 2 feet thick. This was pure insulation. The thicker the earth layer, the more stable the interior temperature would become. Finally, he added sod. He cut sections of prairie grass with their root systems intact and laid them over the bare earth like puzzle pieces. The roots would grow together, binding the soil and preventing erosion. Within weeks, the entire structure would look like a natural hillside covered in vegetation. The living roof was complete by mid-July. From a distance, the shelter was nearly invisible, just another grass-covered mound in the Montana landscape. The entrance required precision. Matthias built a doorframe from split logs, creating an arched opening 4 feet tall and 2.5 feet wide. The size was deliberate. Large enough for a man to enter carrying supplies, small enough to minimize heat loss. Every square inch of opening was a place where warmth could escape. He shaped the arch carefully, cutting the logs to match the curve of his tunnel. The frame was set into the earth walls and reinforced with stones packed tightly around its perimeter. This prevented shifting and created a solid structure that would not degrade over time. The door itself was thick planks hewn from pine, fitted together with wooden pegs and reinforced with leather straps on the interior side. It was heavy, perhaps 40 pounds, but it sealed the opening completely when closed. Matthias installed simple iron hinges he had purchased in a trading post the previous year. Originally intended for a storage shed, he never built. The hinges were mounted deep into the doorframe, bolted through with iron pins. A wooden bar on the interior served as the locking mechanism. The bar dropped into iron brackets mounted on either side of the frame. When engaged, the door could not be opened from outside without breaking through the wood itself. Inside the chamber, Matthias laid a floor of flat stones. He had collected them from the creek over several weeks, selecting pieces that fit together with minimal gaps. The stone floor served multiple purposes. It provided a solid surface that would not turn to mud. It acted as thermal mass, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it slowly at night. It prevented moisture from wicking up from the earth below. The fire pit was small, positioned near the center of the chamber, but slightly offset toward the entrance. Matthias lined it with stones and created a chimney using the ventilation shaft that extended through the roof peak. The chimney was narrow, just 6 inches in diameter, too small for significant heat loss, but adequate for smoke ventilation. He built a sleeping platform along one curved wall, raising it 2 feet off the floor. Cold air settled low. Warm air rose. Sleeping elevated meant sleeping in the warmest part of the chamber. Beneath the platform, he created storage space for supplies, tools, and the pelts he would continue to trap. Shelves carved into the earthen walls provided additional storage. Matthias reinforced these alcoves with flat stones to prevent collapse. He placed his rifle, powder horn, and essential tools within easy reach of the sleeping platform. The final detail was testing. Throughout July and early August, Matthias spent nights in the shelter while continuing to sleep in his old cabin during the day. He monitored temperature, checked for moisture accumulation, adjusted ventilation, and refined his fire management. The interior stayed consistently between 52 and 55 degrees without fire. A small flame raised the temperature to 65 within an hour. The structure was working exactly as he had envisioned. By late August, Matthias moved his remaining possessions underground. The Badger Hole, as everyone called it, was now his home. September brought the first hints of approaching winter. Matthias settled into his underground routine while his neighbors prepared in conventional ways. They chinked gaps in their log cabins, stockpiled firewood, and reinforced doors against the wind they knew was coming. They worked with the confidence of men who understood their methods, even if those methods were imperfect. Matthias worked differently. He monitored his shelter's performance with the attention of a man conducting an experiment upon which his life depended. Every morning he checked the interior temperature using a simple thermometer he had acquired years earlier. The readings remained stable. 52 degrees. When outside, temperatures dropped to 40 at night. 54 degrees when afternoon sun warmed the hillside. The Earth's insulation was performing as he had calculated. His firewood needs were minimal. A single armload of wood burned slowly in his small fire pit kept the chamber comfortably warm for an entire day. He estimated his winter fuel consumption would be 1/10 what he had burned in the log cabin. This meant less time cutting wood, less smoke inhalation, and less fire risk. Thomas Whitmore visited in late September. He arrived on horseback, leading a pack mule loaded with supplies for winter. Matthias invited him inside through the small arched entrance. Whitmore had to bend nearly double to enter, and he made a comment about the indignity of crawling into one's home. But once inside, his demeanor changed. The chamber was warm without being stuffy. Light from the entrance and a small tallow candle provided adequate illumination. The curved walls created a sense of enclosed security, rather than oppressive confinement. Whitmore examined the stone floor, the sleeping platform, the fire pit design. He asked technical questions about ventilation, moisture control, and structural stability. Matthias answered each question thoroughly. He explained the cold sink effect of the entrance tunnel, the way the living roof shed water while adding insulation, the thermal mass principle that kept temperatures stable. Whitmore listened carefully. Before leaving, he asked if Matthias would be willing to help him build something similar the following spring, perhaps not as elaborate, but incorporating the same principles. Matthias agreed. Not everyone was interested in learning. Elias Kern stopped by in early October specifically to mock the arrangement. He stood outside the entrance and shouted down questions designed to embarrass. How did Matthias bathe? Did he not feel like a corpse sleeping in a tomb? What woman would ever visit a man who lived in a hole? Matthias did not. To respond to the mockery, he simply continued his preparations. He trapped beaver and muskrat, processed pelts, and stored dried meat in his cool underground alcoves. He reinforced the entrance against snow accumulation and cleared drainage channels around the shelter's perimeter. By November, word had spread through the trapping community that Crane was actually living underground full-time. Some considered it proof of insanity. Others were curious whether he would survive his first winter in the Badger Hole. Silas Drummond predicted confidently that Matthias would be dead by February, suffocated by smoke or crushed by collapsed earth. The winter would prove who understood shelter and who merely thought they did. The winter of 1852 began normally. December brought snow and cold, but nothing exceptional. Matthias maintained his trap lines and lived comfortably in his earth shelter. His neighbors burned wood steadily in their cabins and considered the season manageable. By Christmas, the accumulated snowfall measured 14 inches, typical for the Montana Territory. Then the weather changed. On December 27th, the temperature dropped suddenly. What had been 15 degrees above zero in the afternoon fell to 10 below by midnight. The next day brought no warming. The temperature continued falling, 20 below, 30 below. By the evening of December 29th, the cold was unlike anything the settlers had experienced in recent memory. Matthias felt the change, but his shelter protected him from its full force. Outside, the air was cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. Inside his earth mound, the temperature held at 48 degrees. He burned slightly more wood than usual, bringing the interior to a comfortable 60 degrees, but his fuel consumption remained modest. His neighbors were not so fortunate. Silas Drummond burned through 3 days' worth of firewood in a single night, trying to keep his cabin above freezing. The logs he had carefully notched and chinked the previous autumn proved inadequate against the extreme cold. Heat poured out through gaps he could not see, through the roof where warm air rose and escaped, through the doorframe where cold air found every crack. His fire roared constantly, consuming wood faster than seemed possible, yet the far corners of his cabin stayed cold enough to freeze water. Other settlers faced similar struggles. Thomas Whitmore kept his family alive by maintaining 2 fires simultaneously, one in the hearth and another in a makeshift brazier near the sleeping area. The smoke was oppressive, but the alternative was freezing. His children coughed through the night while he hauled wood from his dwindling supply. Elias Kern's situation was worst. His cabin was smaller than most, built hastily 2 years earlier with poor chinking. He burned everything combustible he could spare: furniture, spare lumber, tool handles. The interior temperature still dropped low enough that ice formed on the walls by morning. The cold continued. December 30th brought no relief. The temperature remained locked at 35 below zero. New Year's Day of 1853 was colder still. Trappers throughout the territory abandoned their lines and focused solely on survival. Some doubled up in cabins, sharing body heat and firewood. Others slaughtered livestock for meat and burned the fat for additional warmth. Matthias ventured outside briefly on January 1st to check his surroundings. The world was still and hostile. Smoke rose from every cabin chimney in thick columns, evidence of desperate fires burning continuously. He could hear the sound of axes biting into wood as men cut through their stockpiles at unsustainable rates. He returned to his shelter, descended through the small entrance, and closed the heavy door behind him. The warmth wrapped around him immediately. His small fire burned steadily, requiring only occasional feeding. The earth that surrounded him held its temperature despite the lethal cold above. Outside, his neighbors were beginning to break. Elias Kern arrived at Matthias's shelter on the night of January 2nd, 1853. Matthias heard the pounding on his door around 10 in the evening, irregular and weak. He opened it to find Elias collapsed in the entrance tunnel, shaking violently, his lips blue with cold. Matthias dragged him inside and closed the door. Elias could barely speak. His cabin had become uninhabitable. Despite a fire that consumed wood as fast as he could feed it, the interior temperature had dropped below freezing. Ice formed on the walls. His water bucket froze solid within an hour of bringing it inside. He had wrapped himself in every blanket he owned and huddled next to the fireplace, but the cold was winning. When he realized he would not survive the night, he had stumbled through the darkness to the only place he knew might be warm. The badger hole he had mocked for 8 months. Within 20 minutes of entering Matthias's shelter, Elias stopped shaking. The consistent warmth penetrated his clothing and reached his core. He sat near the small fire pit, hands extended toward flames no larger than a cooking fire, and stared at the earthen walls in disbelief. The chamber was genuinely warm, not just survivable, but comfortable. He asked how this was possible. Matthias explained, while preparing food. The earth insulated against temperature extremes. 6 feet of soil maintained stable temperature regardless of surface conditions. The dome shape eliminated corners where cold could concentrate. The small entrance prevented warm air from escaping. The thermal mass of the stone floor absorbed and released heat gradually. Every element worked together to create a space that required minimal heating. Elias listened and said nothing. He had called this shelter a grave. He had predicted Matthias would suffocate or freeze. He had been wrong about everything. Around midnight, more pounding came from the entrance. Matthias opened the door to find Thomas Whitmore and his wife, both exhausted from the cold. Their cabin was consuming wood faster than they could sustain. They had left their children with neighbors and come to see if the stories about Crane's warm shelter were true. They entered and immediately felt the difference. Thomas examined the structure with new appreciation, understanding for the first time what Matthias had built. His wife sat on the sleeping platform and wept with relief at the warmth. By dawn, 8 people crowded into the chamber designed for one. Silas Drummond arrived at 4 in the morning, pride finally broken by cold that had nearly killed him. 2 other trappers came separately, having heard that Crane's earth shelter was the warmest place within 20 miles. The space was cramped. People sat shoulder to shoulder. But even overcrowded, even with the door opening repeatedly to admit new arrivals, the shelter remained warm. The principle Matthias had discovered held true. Earth protected better than timber. Thermal mass defeated extreme cold. Innovation born from grief had created the only genuinely safe shelter in the territory. Outside, the temperature remained 38 degrees below zero. Inside, surrounded by the men who had mocked him, Matthias maintained his small fire and said very little. The extreme cold broke on January 5, 1853. Temperatures rose to 10 below zero, then to 0, then finally above freezing by mid-January. The settlers who had survived did so with depleted wood supplies, damaged cabins, and a new understanding of how inadequate their shelters truly were. 5 men approached Matthias in late January asking for help building earth shelters of their own. Thomas Whitmore was first. He selected a hillside location similar to Matthias's and began excavation in early February. Matthias visited regularly, explaining the principles he had learned through experience. The dome shape for weight distribution, the importance of proper drainage, the layering system that created waterproofing and insulation, the small entrance that minimized heat loss. Whitmore's shelter was completed by April. It was slightly larger than Matthias's, designed to accommodate his family, but it followed the same fundamental design. When finished, it maintained stable temperature with minimal heating, exactly as Matthias had promised. Silas Drummond never apologized for his mockery, but he built an earth shelter in the spring of 1854. He told others he was simply trying a different building method, but everyone knew the truth. The freeze had taught him that traditional wisdom could be wrong and that survival mattered more than pride. By 1856, 11 earth shelters existed within 30 miles of Matthias's original structure. The technique spread through conversation and observation. Trappers and settlers moving through the region saw the mounds covered in grass and asked questions. Those who had survived the freeze of '52 shared their stories. The badger hole that had been ridiculed became the model for a new kind of frontier shelter. Matthias continued trapping until 1868. He lived in his earth shelter year-round, maintaining the structure and refining details based on 16 years of continuous habitation. The wooden framework remained sound. The living roof required occasional patching where erosion exposed bare earth, but the basic system proved remarkably durable. The interior stayed dry, warm in winter, and cool in summer. He left the mountains in 1869, selling his trap lines and equipment to a younger man. He moved to a small settlement in the western Montana Territory where he worked as a carpenter and lived quietly. He married in 1871, though his wife died within a year of fever. He had no children. Matthias Crane died on November 12, 1875, at age 61. He was buried in a cemetery outside the settlement, his grave marked with a simple wooden cross that deteriorated within a decade. No one recorded his innovations in any formal history. No newspaper mentioned his contributions to frontier architecture. But in the mountains he had left behind, his shelter remained. The earth walls held firm. The living roof continued to shed water and provide insulation. Other shelters built using his methods protected new inhabitants through winters that would have killed them in conventional cabins. The legacy was not written in words or carved in stone. It was built into hillsides across the Montana Territory, quiet testimony to what one man learned from grief and cold, and what he shared freely so others might survive.